Welcome to the Tech Panel.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The podcast where tech minds meet.
Oh hey, before we get started today, don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. In this episode, we're joined by Colin Kinner, founder and CEO of Startup Onramp, Australia's leading incubator for early-stage startups. With over 20 years' experience running startup accelerators, early-stage venture funds and Silicon Valley missions, Colin has coached and mentored countless successful founders while helping others avoid common pitfalls. Since 2017, Startup Onramp has supported over 2,000 founders through online courses, workshop, mentoring and pre-accelerator programs. Colin's extensive contributions to the startup ecosystem include authoring reports for Australia's chief scientist, editing the Entrepreneur's Guide, and creating Microsoft's Global Founders Hub learning content. Join us as Colin shares his wealth of knowledge on what it takes to launch and grow a successful startup. This is one conversation you don't want to miss.
Colin, let's start with a bit about big picture, right? Tell us a bit more about your company and what sort of inspired you to start your organization.
Sure. So Startup Onramp is something I started about 8 years ago. Having worked with lots of startups as a person running incubators and accelerators and early stage venture funds, I'd worked with lots of startup founders and I'd seen some be really successful. And I thought it was really interesting to observe what things they had in common, what traits and behaviors actually led them to be successful early on. And on the flip side, I saw a lot of startups that didn't work out, for lots and lots of reasons. But I thought it'd be really helpful for new startup founders to have access to those insights, to be able to say, well, what are the things that are likely to be helpful for me in the first year or two of starting my own company? And what are the things that are, the pitfalls, the things that I'm likely to screw up? And if I can avoid making those mistakes, then, my chances of success are going to be that bit higher. So Startup Onramp is effectively a series of programs that work with startup founders in the first couple of years of their startup, helping to give them some basic guidance. People become doctors after studying for many years to learn medicine, right?
Mm-hmm.
People start startups, often without really knowing much about startups. So, someone described what we do recently as a crash course on how to start a startup and not screw it up, right? So we're really just helping people to have access to the best practice, I guess, in terms of what's going to help them.
I can definitely see the value in being able to leverage skills such as yours. And just give us a bit of taste of how many startups you've worked with so far.
Yeah, over the last 8 years, about 2,000 companies.
Wow.
So most of them in Australia, increasingly from internationally. We're based in Queensland, so a lot of the companies that we've worked with are in Queensland, but we've also run programs in New South Wales, Victoria, doing some work currently through the Northern Territory government, working with some entrepreneurs up there. So it's been fun. Like I joke that I've seen just about every way there is to fail in a startup, and I think I probably have.
What's in regards to how you're going forward, what are some of the key factors that distinguish founders?
Well, I've never heard this sound before.
Come in.
What is that?
You've got a delivery.
Oh, thank you.
It's a mystery box.
It's a mystery box. So what are the key factors that distinguish founders who succeed in your program from those who struggle within it?
Yeah, there are a few things. I mean, the first, I guess, is domain expertise. The successful founders that I've worked with over the years tend to be the ones who have worked in an industry for long enough that they have some really deep insights, and they come at the problem space with a more nuanced idea of what problem they want to solve, who their customer is, why their customer is going to care about a solution, and then importantly, what solution they should build. There are exceptions to that. There have been founders and, maybe even some well-known ones like Mark Zuckerberg, who perhaps didn't come at it with a lot of deep expertise, but they figured it out really quickly. But generally, the people who make the best progress early on are the ones
Mm-hmm.
that say, look, I really have a deep understanding of what's needed in this space. We also see, I guess, a lot of people who go through the process of figuring out whether being an entrepreneur is for them. And I think, the vast majority of the population are not well suited to being an entrepreneur. And by that, I mean, the life of starting a high growth technology based company is not for a lot of people. It's a rocky road. And I know many of the guests that you've spoken to previously have talked about their own startup
Yeah.
journeys. And I think a lot of people have maybe an unrealistic idea of what being a startup founder is like. And they think that, it's like Shark Tank, where you pitch a couple of investors and they throw money at you and, you
Off it
sail off into
goes.
the sunset.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the, I guess, are there any common pitfalls that you find that happen a lot that is going to sort of be like, yeah, okay, if you do this, you're heading down the track of failure?
So one of the key things people get wrong is they spend too much time and too much money building out their product before they've validated that there's an opportunity, that there's a customer that's going to pay for it, and that they know clearly what product they should build for that customer. So a recent example, I worked with a husband and wife team who came to me having spent about 2 years and about $500,000 of their own money building a quite sophisticated software product. And it was for an industry that they didn't understand particularly well. They were reasonably new to it, and they hadn't really engaged with their target customer at all before spending the time and the money to build this product. And to cut a long story short, effectively what they did was they went through some validation steps, which are a big part of what we do in a lot of our programs, to test and validate their assumptions about their customer.
Mm-hmm.
And they invalidated some of the really key assumptions. So they learned through that process that the product that they thought was going to solve the problem for their target customer was completely the wrong product. So effectively what happened was, they'd flushed 2 years of their life and $500,000 down the
Oh,
toilet.
gosh.
And I hate to see anyone doing that. So,
Yeah.
there's lots of reasons why that happens, but I think often there's a psychological element to it where people find it really difficult to grapple with this idea that they might ask their target customer what they think of their product, and they might get a response that says, actually, not very interested, which is kind of sad, but it happens a lot.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're implying is that the biggest reason why we're seeing a lot of failures out there in the market today is because inventors have an idea where they believe they know what's right, and they don't take into consideration how the market feels about their perceptions. And if they had just tested their ideas with the market first, they have a significantly higher probability of having success as a startup.
Yeah, exactly. And the way I like to get people to think about it, if they're a first-time startup founder, I like them to think about it in the context of partitioning their brain into two halves, right? So you can have the entrepreneur half that says, I'm passionate about building this product and solving this problem. I'm going to go at it 100%. Let's build a really awesome business. And then the other part of their brain is the kind of cynical investor part that says, well, hang on a minute. I'm investing my own time and my own money in building this thing. I'd better convince this investor part of my brain that it's rational and that it's a worthwhile investment of my own time and money. I think people, particularly software developers, actually, I see people frequently put massive chunks of their own time into building a product. They've got the skills, they find it engaging, they build it, but it's still there's an opportunity cost to that chunk of time that they put into it. So I really like to see people go through that process of saying, well, okay, let's do it stepwise. Let's say, for argument's sake, I'm going to commit a month of my time to pursuing this idea that I've got. What would it take for me to commit to that month? Maybe it's a little bit of Googling, maybe it's talk to a few customers, get a rough idea of what I might build. So that's great. You can commit a month of your time. At the end of that, you might say, well, all right, I'm going to set myself another milestone that's, let's say, 3 months of my time and, I don't know, let's say $10,000. I need to spend some money on some external things. There's going to be some thresholds, right? So a rational person, particularly with the kind of investor brain, is going to say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, investing 3 months of my time and $10,000, I need some evidence that this is a good idea. And so that's where it kind of comes into this process of validating ideas with customers and understanding the market, understanding the competitive landscape, all these kind of questions that, that an investor would ask are the same questions that the entrepreneur should ask themselves.
Am I right in assuming that you're implying that this is the most common failure point in startup companies?
Yeah, in my experience, that's the kind of bucket of most common failure points. There's lots of reasons why people build the wrong product,
Mm-hmm.
but I think as a category, building the wrong thing or building something that your customer doesn't really care much about is the biggest failure point. There's plenty of others we could talk about. There's a very long list of ways to fail in a startup. But having looked at the founders that we've worked with over the years, the ones who've been most successful have consistently been the ones who've validated their assumptions really early on. And sometimes they're not wildly wrong, but they might just need to tweak their vision a bit. And so I think there's enormous value in engaging with your target customer early so that you really understand what they need so that you can build it. I mean, it's kind of common sense. And, I have a science background and it's kind of the scientific methodology, right? So you're running little experiments. You're saying, I've got a hypothesis. I'll go test it. If it turns out I was right, then I'll go to the next stage.
You know what they say about common sense, though? It's not that common.
Not that common. No.
No.
It's not that common.
And have you noticed patterns in the backgrounds or mindsets of the individuals that are more apt to drive success in a business than others? Or what are you looking for before you partner with someone, or are you just open to anyone with a startup idea?
Well, our model, Startup Onramp's model, isn't to take an equity stake in any of the companies that we work with. So we're not an investor in the sense that, we only work with the companies that we think have got, the very best chance of success. We work with entrepreneurs. And in fact, I think of what we do more as focusing on building the entrepreneur and their skill set rather than working on their idea.
Right.
Because, the entrepreneur is a person that, they are who they are. They have some strengths, they have some gaps in their knowledge, and we can help them with that. Their idea may be the first thing they've come up with, or maybe the 10th. So I like to think of working with the entrepreneur to help them develop the skills so that they can be successful. It may be with their first idea, and that's great if that's the case. But it might be the 10th that succeeds.
Yeah, I'm always intrigued when we speak to some of these leaders that have begun like as entrepreneurs and they've moved forward. And the common thing is that they've always done like 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 businesses before they've like come around to that idea that's really taken off for them. And the whole thing is that they've learned something from every failure that they've had that they've taken then into this great one that they've gotten. Is that sort of, that's the pattern that I think that we've probably found.
More often than not. People with tenacity.
Yeah, exactly. Is that sort of a general pattern that you find as well? That, as you said, like if the first one and you're there to support it, that's amazing. But do you find often that you will go through a process with these entrepreneurs that it's, it could be their first idea, it might be their 15th. And do they stay with you that whole journey? Do you nurture them through that whole path?
Yeah, if they need it. We tend to work with really early stage founders. So, there's a point at which, I like to see founders kind of say, look, I don't need to go through more programs. I've addressed the knowledge gaps that I had. I've got some useful connections with people who might help me in various, specific areas. No, I just need to get on with it. So I like to see that rather than the kind of long-term, I always worry when I see someone who's been through like 6 accelerator programs. It's like, well, at some point. So to your point, though, about tenacity, I think that's a really crucial attribute. And I've seen that again and again with successful founders. They've got that kind of drive and tenacity to just make things happen at a cadence that maybe a lot of other people just can't do. So there's also balance. Like good founders, I think, can balance that kind of drive and passion and kind of momentum with a critical thinking and analytical mind that says, well, I'm going to pursue this, with everything I've got, but I'm also going to listen to the evidence, from my target market. I'm going to listen to people who've got, experience in other companies that are maybe a bit further advanced than mine. I'm going to listen to investors and take on board that feedback. So I think it's actually quite a rare mix. There's not a lot of people who manage to do a really good job of balancing that kind of drive and passion with the ability to take on board feedback and act on it where they need to.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm definitely not in that basket. I would, I would, I would just be like, no, it's too hard. I can't do it. I'll be a cog in the wheel. I'll help you, but I don't have. I would not be able to do that.
Yeah,
I'm a little bit curious here from a sobering perspective, especially from an audience perspective here. What is the probability as a founder that the first idea that you have that they'd bring to you is likely something that's going to be like striking gold? Or are you finding that it's majority of the time good ideas coming to you, they just need to refine their processes? Or are these people that generally have like 3, 4, 5 ideas before finally something starts to take hold?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think you've obviously got a kind of a definitional problem. At what point does an idea become not the same idea as they started with? So what I would say is almost always the idea that someone starts with either changes quite a bit and it's kind of the same idea, but it's gone in a different direction, or it's completely different. I haven't seen very many instances where somebody says, hey, I've got an idea for a company. I'm going to do X. And then 10 years later, they built X.
Yeah.
It's almost always some step away from their original vision.
Yeah, just sort of organically molds to what's going on.
Yeah. And that comes back to what we were talking about before about, people being able to internalize that feedback and act on it. Without the kind of psychological response that we're all guilty of it. Somebody says, "Oh, I'm not sure if that's a really good idea," and there's the kind of an instinctive reaction that says, "Oh, but it's my idea. I think it's great. So whatever you just said must be wrong." So I think that's a skill that can be learned.
With programs like yours, I imagine there's likely a tendency for people to become reliant on someone like you, right? Like if I'm an inventor, I want to create a product, and if the likelihood of it being successful depends on having access to someone like you, do you think there's a tendency to become over-dependent on resources like yourselves? Or what do you think is the likelihood that they're able to actually extract and apply the methods that you recommend versus having a problem, coming back to you, seeing if you can solve it, help them, guide them through the process? Like, are these people actually becoming better at the way that they approach their problems? Or again, are they just being dependent on someone like you?
Yeah, look, I've seen people go in both directions. I've seen people who become reliant on external help. And like I was saying before, you meet people who've been through multiple accelerator programs and they're constantly looking for new things that can help them. That to me is a massive red flag. I think if you're going to be successful as an entrepreneur, you need to be able to say, look, okay, I'll get some help on specific things, and then I'm just going to go do it. Like, leave me alone, get out of my way. So the people who have that kind of mindset of, yes, I want help and I'm willing to accept, input on things, but then I just need to get on with it. That's a really good sign as far as I'm concerned. I actually saw that early on in Startup Onramp. We used to run, kind of cohort-based programs exclusively, where we would get 10 or 12 startup founders in a room. We'd work with them over a 10 or 12 week program, and I realized that actually a lot of people don't need that. So what we ended up doing a few years back was launching an online course. It's called our Founders Course, and it's basically kind of a self-paced set of learning resources that people can dip in and out of. So they can say, well, okay, look, I'm pretty sure I know how to build an MVP and what that looks like, and why a minimum viable product's an important thing. I don't need to learn about that. So I don't need to sit through a bunch of stuff on that. But when it comes to branding, for example, I've no idea. So I'll do the module on branding. Or it might be that they say, look, I've never raised money for investors. I don't really understand, what investors are looking for. So I'll do the kind of learning module on that. And I think that's been a really helpful transition for a lot of those founders that just say, look, I recognize I've got some skills gaps, but I don't want to sit through a whole bunch of stuff, every week with a bunch of people who maybe need more help than I do.
So what exactly, how would you balance offering guidance versus encouraging independence with these people that need to ultimately run a business on their own?
Yeah, well, the easy way is we just have fixed end programs. I'm currently running a program funded by the Queensland government for female founders, and it's part of the Advanced Queensland initiative. And they've said, look, we want to support and encourage more female founders in Queensland. So we're running programs like a pre-accelerator, for example, which runs for 8 weeks. And the 10 founders who get accepted into that program get intensive support for 8 weeks, and then the program finishes. So they come into it knowing that they can access mentors and online learning, and they can get help from their peers, the other founders in that cohort. But at the end of it, they've got to just go and build a business. So I think that's a helpful way of giving people a kind of a burning platform.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the quote I've got here is, you've developed content for Microsoft's Founders Hub and authored the Entrepreneur's Guide. That's correct?
Yeah.
And what has been some of the more challenging concepts that you've worked to simplify to make it easier for entrepreneurs to adopt?
Yeah. So I find myself often in conversations with founders, and I kind of realize that there's something that they're not very familiar with. It might be raising money, or it might be how to build their team or whatever. And I often find myself saying, "Oh, there's this really good book. There's a Steve Blank book on that, or there's a book by Brad Feld all about how to raise money. You should read it." And what I've realized over the years is that people don't read books.
Nope.
Or maybe sometimes they do, but this heap of books that in theory every startup founder should be familiar with.
Yeah.
People are time poor, and they got lots of things to do, so they tend not to. So my approach has always been to say, let's kind of distill down the key learnings from all of those resources and all of the experts and great case studies that we can look to here in Australia and overseas, and then just there's this concept of teachable moments, right? So you might have heard of this, where when somebody's ready to learn something, it's usually because they've got to a point in their journey where they realize, here's an obstacle, and I don't know how to overcome it. It might be, I'm about to run out of money and I need to find, a way to fund my company, or I don't know how to, I've built my product, but I don't know how to get customers. How do I actually do sales and marketing and build my brand? And at that point, there's a teachable moment where if you say to them, here's some resources that can actually help you with that specific thing, they're much more receptive than if you say, hey, here's a course on everything to do with, entrepreneurship. So that's always been the approach that we've taken, is to say, well, what does this person need to address a skills gap that's relevant to them right now?
I don't know, it just gives me so much anxiety to think that some people are running their business in a way where they're just thinking to themselves, I won't get ahead of the problem. I'll wait till I run into an issue.
Yeah.
And then I'll reach out
Sure.
to someone like yourself for help.
Sure. I mean, in an ideal world, everyone would read, a bunch of stuff and do a bunch of learning in advance. But, humans are funny creatures. It's how we work.
Are you finding audiences are gravitating more towards video content? Like you said before, that people aren't reading. I just, there's got to be so much information that you'd have to teach someone before they try to found their own business.
Yeah.
Is it all exclusively video or reading? Like what does the mix look like?
Yeah, I mean, I've experimented with both, and I know a lot of other programs have likewise, kind of doubled down on video in recent years. So our founders course is almost entirely video,
Mhm.
but it's bite-sized modules. It's kind of 15 to 20-minute modules on each topic. Case studies with interviews with founders who'll kind of talk about how they dealt with that particular topic, whether it's building a team or raising money or whatever. That seems to work really well, for people, who might say, well, I'm just going to sit on the sofa, 8:00 at night and I'll watch 2 modules. That works really well. And people get through that. We've got about 8 hours worth of content. So they get through it in, usually 4 to 6 weeks is pretty typical.
Hmm.
The work that I did with Microsoft for Startups, which is now the content in their Founders Hub, is entirely text-based. And for Microsoft, their view was that for the founders that they're supporting globally, text makes a whole more sense for them in terms of engaging, because that's the way that they've delivered a lot of content in the past. And they've had now tens of thousands of founders go through that content. So, people can read, but it's fairly short and punchy and, nothing more than a kind of 5-minute read per topic.
I may be stereotyping here, but I feel like there's a bit of agreement from your perspective here. Do you feel like that clashes with the demographics of younger people gravitating into this space? Right? I find so often we're dealing with people that are like,
Makes sense.
yeah,
Mm.
I can't get people to sit down for an onboarding video
Yeah.
where it's
Yep.
like it's 30 minutes and it'll make your life infinitely easier. They're like, do you have a 5-minute version of this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
How do you distill something like a textbook to get your company up and running?
Or is
Yeah.
it just because the those people that are that way minded, that want to be entrepreneurs and are being entrepreneurs, that they're going to put in
Mm-hmm.
that extra effort to do that, opposed to just the standard human
Interesting.
like myself?
So you're saying, do you think it is, correct me if I'm wrong here, if
Yeah.
I'm getting this wrong. Are you implying that maybe this book, because it's written, it's a really good way to weed out some of the people that aren't going to be able to take it as serious? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think it's a great filter.
Yeah.
I don't think you can be. I think your chances of being successful as a founder are much lower if you haven't got the ability to do, big chunks of work. And a chunk of work might be reading a book or, a chapter of a book or whatever. It might be, attending all 8 of the weekly kind of master classes that we run in our program. And, we've had people that kind of drop out or attend 50% of them, whatever. And that's a very strongly correlated with them not being successful in their company. Well, I'll
Yeah.
give you a counter example. One of the first companies that went through our pre-accelerator program here in Brisbane was a company called SurePact. It was founded by a lady called Megan Avard, and Megan would meet with me and the other mentors each week to kind of talk about her progress in her company. And each week we'd kind of review what we talked about last week and say, well, how did you get on with the 3 things that we talked about? And Megan would invariably say, oh, I did all those 3 things like the next morning, and I've done these other 15 things that I want your input on. And I also want you to help me to connect to this investor or this person that could help me. And I want some input on this. And do you know this person? And
Is that music to your ears when you hear that?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that's a massive sign that here's
Yeah.
somebody who's tenacious and just, gets stuff done at a rate that most people don't. And, if you look at how startups have succeeded globally against, very big established competitors, one of the things that they consistently have done is just move faster. So, if you look at Dropbox as an example, there's a really good case study there. They went through Y Combinator, the startup accelerator in Silicon Valley, right back in the very early days of Dropbox. And at the time, Google and Microsoft and a bunch of other big companies had kind of online file sharing backup things already. And Dropbox basically said, we're going to do it a little bit better, but we're just going to move faster. Like, they're big, slow, bureaucratic businesses. So we're just going to go really, really fast. And like, that's how they got going.
do you despair about the thought that if younger people are gravitating more and more towards video content that is shorter and shorter, that the likelihood of having more and more founders in the market is going to drop?
Not
Is
a
it
great
reasonable
deal,
to
That's
be
an
despair?
honest.
interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's for sure, that's a phenomenon. And I don't know how that will impact the kinds of businesses that get created. Let me just give you a little data point. The average age of people who've been through any of Startup Onramp's programs over the last 8.5 years is 42. So we're seeing people who have experience in the workforce. They've worked in an industry for 10 plus years. They have really good insights. Like I was saying before, they have deep insights because they've spent enough time what we call marinating in the problem space, right? So they've marinated in that space for long enough that they're really soaked up, a really deep understanding of what what needs to be done to solve a particular problem. And I really like those founders. That's not to say that we don't work with kind of 20-year-old founders, but it's much more difficult for them because they've got to typically I'm generalizing here, that they typically have to go and learn about the problem space
Yeah.
really quickly. And sometimes that can be, quite expensive because you've got to spend a long time talking to people and, nobody's buying your product while you're doing that. So the older founders or the more experienced founders tend to have that advantage.
What so you mentioned before, so you're starting to go not just within Australia, so you're starting to reach out more globally. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
So what do you think then, having your base knowledge of Australian entrepreneurs and founders, what lessons can we learn as Australians from places like Silicon Valley and other hubs around the world that have really sort of, I think Austin's another one now, like in Texas, like there's really places that have blown up. What can we take from those situations and bring that knowledge back to our Australians that are, trying to start their businesses?
Yeah, probably quite a few things. So I spent a couple of years living and working in London, actually running an early stage venture fund over there that invested in startups. And I've also spent some time in Silicon Valley helping to start a program called Startup Catalyst, which is effectively an immersion program for first-time startup founders to go and spend, a couple of weeks in Silicon Valley soaking up that kind of startup culture.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the really obvious things that you notice straight away when you spend time in particularly Silicon Valley is there's an attitude of thinking really big from the beginning. So we took several groups of mostly kind of early 20s entrepreneurs over to Silicon Valley, and they got to spend time with their peers. So it wasn't a kind of a startup tourism thing where it was all about hanging out at Google and Facebook, and we did a bit of that, but they actually spent meaningful chunks of time with their peers, other early stage founders in that ecosystem. And the immediate difference that you could see was that the Silicon Valley founders were all saying, I've got a vision to build $1 billion company. I'm going to absolutely disrupt this industry. Here's how I'm going to do it. Whereas the Aussies said, I've got an idea. I think it's probably not very good, but I really like the idea of being a startup founder. So I'm going to try my best to, and everyone just goes, no, don't, you're starting on the wrong foot. Like you've really got to have a vision that says, I'm going to build a really wildly successful business.
Do you think that's a difference because that what you just said then, that is so Australian versus so American?
Sure.
Very accurate.
Yeah. Do you think that's something that like our founders are going to have to learn to be like, right, I need to be bullheaded. I need to back. This is another thing that always comes back from people we talk to, is that back yourself.
Sure.
Because all people that we've spoken to are always like, you've got to back yourself and and what you don't know, get people that surround you that does know. So do we need to change our mentality to like really get these $1 billion businesses and think more like the people in Silicon Valley, are more like the USA?
Yeah, I think we do, but changing culture at a national level isn't an easy task, right? So no one's going to achieve that overnight. It's happening. Like, if you look even in the last 10 years, there's been a massive shift, and I think a positive shift in the Australian startup scene in terms of the way people think about startups and their kind of, and it's partly because, we've seen the Atlassians and the Canvas and, there's now a long list of Australian $1 billion plus tech companies that people can point to and say, I get that. I can see that's, particularly when you've got young founders like, Melanie Perkins, starting a company and in what seems like a short period of time, it's actually been, quite a few years now, but in a relatively short period of time, building a multi-billion-dollar company. So I think people can see that and they can kind of emulate it, at least to some extent, and say, well, I can see that that's a path that I could take. The other bit of it is that I actually think some of it is just about communication skills. I mean, I think Americans, I'll generalize again, but are really good at making their point, right? So one thing I learned listening to a lot of pitches from US startups is that, don't get a big head, James.
American.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
But I really do think that there's a communication skills difference here. And so US-based startup founders tend to be really good at making declarative statements in their pitches. So if you listen to an investor pitch, you'll often hear the founder say, here is my point. It might be, this is a $10 billion global market, and here's the part of that market that's really underserved. We're going to serve that part of the market, and we're going to build a really big business. Australian founders tend to really struggle with that. Maybe it's part cultural, maybe it's part the way they're taught in school to communicate, but they tend to make all of the kind of supporting statements and provide a little bit of factual information or a bit of market research, but they stop short of making the declarative statement that says, here is my point. So I think people can learn that skill, and we actually do a lot of work with founders on pitching skills to be able to say, even simple stuff like when you've got a PowerPoint slide, right? If you're delivering a in-person presentation, headings on your slides should be statements.
Yep.
It shouldn't say, the classic one is people have team, and then they have the mugshots of the co-founders or whatever. If you have in your slide, the heading that says, our team have the right skills to solve this problem, and then you talk about the team, even little things like that, just get your point across.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I've seen this come from both angles. I mean, I absolutely think there's a time and a place for someone who has a perspective and strongly believes that they have the right solution and mentality to shake the market up. But I've also had the luxury of living in both of these countries, and I see the value in the way that Australia approaches a lot of these things as well. For example, I mean, I forget the video that I watched where they talked about this, but essentially they boiled it down to Americans can get really quickly into this mindset of believing if they just invest a little bit more, throw a bit more energy into their idea, it will finally break through, and they'll often just drive the business into the ground because it never had any opportunity.
It's almost like an arrogance towards it. Yeah.
Whereas Australians and UK market, when I work with them, it's a lot more like, we think we have a really good idea, but let's hedge our bets.
Yeah. It's an interesting balance because I think to be successful as a founder, you need a fair amount of unreasonableness, right? So
you could see that.
I mean, you no doubt you've met a bunch of founders that that come across that way, and I think there's a limit to the unreasonableness. At some point, then people can't work with that individual because they're so unreasonable. But I think if people can kind of harness their unreasonableness to be able to say, well, look, I'm going to push, even though most people would say, look, you should probably stop, or this isn't really going to work, or whatever. I think it's really helpful to have that. But as I was saying before, you've got to be able to balance it by saying, well, if it's really, obviously dead end that you're heading down, like you need to be able to see that at some point.
Well, while we're on that topic, obviously we're asking, what are some great things that we could take from America and bring over here? What are some bad things that we feel that you don't think is good for Australia to
what do we
absorb
do
into
better?
ours?
I think we're much better at being capital efficient. So one of the challenges in the Australian startup ecosystem is that we have less access to capital, even though it's improved a lot over the last decade. We still have relatively poor access to seed stage capital, like pre-launch. If I was in Silicon Valley, and I had an idea that had, some merit, there's a reasonable chance that I'd be able to pitch some investors and get them to fund it before I'd built the product. It's getting harder, but it's still a thing that happens regularly. In Australia, that's almost unheard of. Most early stage VCs, most angel groups look at businesses and they say, okay, that's interesting. Prove to me that you have a business. And prove means, show me that you've got customers and revenues and that revenues are growing. And then I'm really interested to talk about investing. But before that point, they're typically looking at it going, well, that's interesting. Come back and tell us how you're getting on in 3 months or 6 months. So I think what that's done to the Australian ecosystem is it's forced entrepreneurs to be more capital efficient, to be able to say, well, I can get to an MVP or I can get something into the hands of customers quickly and cheaply, rather than the kind of, I'm not going to say default approach in the US, but certainly a more common approach in the US is to say, I've got a vision, for a business, I'm going to go raise a stack of money, and then we're going to go build a product.
My mind goes in this direction. When I imagine a successful startup, the mindset I believe that you need to have, and I could be wrong about this, I haven't started my own business, is that the more frugal you are, the higher probability of success, even though that's not going to be like the pillar of any successful company. But people that recognize the value of every penny and every second, those people have a higher probability of being successful. And thinking of, on this topic of things that maybe we don't want to absorb into our culture, I wonder, do you think, it's a controversial question here, do you think DEI initiatives from the US, bringing those in over here, could get in the way of starting up a company? Because if you're focusing on equity, say making sure everyone's happy and balancing their time, and I just feel like that goes completely against the idea of like running a good startup where everyone's investing way more than the bare minimum.
So I would say that I really worry about what I'm hearing, is happening in the US in terms of removing a whole bunch of DEI programs, because I think that most likely is going to be a catastrophe. I would say that when you've got a competitive ecosystem, competitive for talent, right? So you've got lots of companies that are looking for really smart people. You really have to build a work environment that people want to work in. And that, that might be things like remote working for people who, where that works best for them. It might be, remember that DEI doesn't just mean, diversity in terms of gender or ethnicity or cultural background or whatever. It includes things like, accommodations for people who have a disability, right? It includes things, that actually allow people who are in disadvantaged groups to be in the workforce. So I think, when you're competing for talent, if Australia was to say, we're going to reduce our kind of emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think there's a real danger that we end up making it more difficult to bring in the talent that we need in these companies. So I think that's a real risk for us.
It's definitely an interesting way. Hindsight's always 20/20, right? Like you can always look back and go, oh, I wish we had done this, or wish we had done that. And just in regards to starting your business yourself. But just before we jump into the next question, I'm kind of dying to see what's in this box.
Oh, yeah, the box.
Have you been thinking about the box the whole time?
I was wondering what was going on. I have no idea what's happening here.
It said here.
Was it a mystery question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. We've got a viewer question.
We've got a viewer question.
All right.
This is first time.
Cool.
That this has happened.
What's going on here? What's the most bizarre or hilarious pitch you've ever heard from as a startup founder, and did it actually work?
I've seen quite a few that were questionable. So I'll give you two examples. One was a backyard inventor who'd come up with a perpetual motion machine that literally was claiming to generate free electricity using magnets.
Yeah.
So I had to direct him to the Wikipedia page that talked about the first law of entropy, right? So there's some physics that maybe was going to get in the way of that one.
What if he broke it? What if he solved that problem for us?
Well, he'll do very well if he solves that one.
Yep.
The other one I've seen was in the medtech space. It was a spray-on condom. So like some kind of fast drying polyurethane in a can, shake it up and spray it on product. And they were looking for funding to do clinical trials.
Jeez, that's first.
Not one I could help them with.
I how many bananas do you reckon they sprayed?
Seriously.
You don't want to know.
Oh, wow.
That's 100% the product you'd find out later on. Like the Cancer Foundation would be like, people who use this product are apt to have increase of...
So there's been an increase in like birth deformities or something like that.
Yeah.
That's
but you know what? You asked, there's actually a serious side to that question, which I think is maybe worth touching on. The ideas that make sense for a startup are often the ones that on first glance look like they're going to be a bit crazy, right?
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
So if you think of it this way, you can draw like a Venn diagram. You get two intersecting sets in this diagram, right? So one set is things that are actually a good idea, and the other is things that are Actually, let's not do that. It's gonna we'll come back from that. It's going to take 10 minutes to explain it, and I haven't got the diagram. But if you
Just
think
gonna
about
leave us on that note?
if you think about startups that have been successful, the ones that have been wildly successful tend to be the ones that started off with something that people thought was not going to work, and therefore they didn't have a whole heap of competitors. So, like if you think about Airbnb as an example, when it started, like today, people think of Airbnb as, oh yeah, of course, everyone uses it. It's really good. But when it started, most people said that's a really dumb idea. That is not going to work. Not on any kind of scale, because people aren't going to let some
Uber.
stranger stay in their house. That's weird.
Yeah.
Uber, of course.
Yep. Yeah. That's and it comes back, I think, to the old adage: when there's a problem, no matter really how crazy it is, someone is going to do something and find something and work out something to make it better.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Like the little bit on the end of your shoelace.
Oh, I see what you're going with that.
Yeah. Okay.
I have an idea, guys. Hear me out.
Yeah. I've got an idea about, making the end of your shoelace harder so you can thread it.
Yeah. Well,
brilliant.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Yeah.
I'll definitely give you that one.
It worked.
It did. And that would have been a crazy ass idea at the time.
Yeah.
You touched on for a moment there an initiative where you were running a pre-accelerator encouraging women into the space.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to any critics that say you're inadvertently reinforcing barriers that single out women versus putting them on an equal playing field?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the figures, there's a large proportion of all successful startups are founded by men still, and a large proportion of startups that receive venture capital funding are founded by men. So, and there's obviously reinforcing loops there. The majority of venture capital investors are men. So I think there is a need to encourage more women to explore entrepreneurship. I'm not a believer in saying, for example, if you're an investor, we're going to have quotas and we're going to ensure that we invest in, a certain number of female-founded startups versus male-founded startups. Unless you can be really confident that the quality of the business is equal or similar. What I do think is really important, though, is to encourage more women into this space, because there are kind of historical barriers. I mean, even in kind of STEM education, if you look at computer science graduates, we've still got an imbalance there from a gender perspective. So we're not seeing as many women coming into the tech sector with the skills that enable them to start tech companies. So I think there is a need, and there's real value because it increases the size of the talent pool. There's real sense in saying, let's create programs that encourage women who might be interested in entrepreneurship or who might be interested in pursuing a STEM career in some form to have a go at it and explore it. And, Startup Onramp has always been about working with people right at the very beginning of that journey. We don't claim to, to help people who are kind of 5-10 years into building their business. But I think there's a lot that can be done to kind of get people past those initial hurdles. Sometimes they're cultural hurdles where, somebody might say, I want to build a tech company. And then, their friends and family often, inadvertently give them advice that kind of effectively says, why don't you get a job where you can get a, nice, safe job and a salary and superannuation and, all that.
It's scary. Like, I don't, being the only female here, not sure if you guys have noticed. Yeah. I just assumed gender. But I've been, a mother and everything, and that aside that a female is, and that's not taking away from the fathers, but the mothers are generally the person at home with the children and that. So there's a lot of time sucked there out of their career. And then getting back into the workplace and then the thought of, okay, so I've gone back, and as you just said, like superannuation, then you've got sick days, you've actually got some leave time. And the thought, I think, of going, I'm going to risk all that and go out and try this is scary, because you've got those kids. I know dad's probably still working and stuff like that, but it would almost be like an isolation away from the familiar to you, with the extra, I guess, pressure of knowing that your kids are at home and having that big gap in the workforce as well. Don't know, just food for thought.
Yeah, I think there's also a life stage element to this. I think there are times in anyone's life where it's harder or easier to start a company, particularly when we talk about tech company where there's a lot of risk and it's intense and all of that. And I think for any individual, you can kind of have that honest conversation, maybe with your partner or some friends, and say, well, is this right for me? This is what I'm thinking of doing. Can you help me to kind of sanity check it? And
Yeah.
this it's not, you can't always have the optimal kind of timing, but if somebody's literally just had their third child, that's probably not the right time to go and throw everything to throw caution to the wind and become an entrepreneur. But if they've just been made redundant from their job and they've got a nice little pay packet and they've got the ability to take 6 months off and not have
Yeah.
to earn a living, like maybe that's a good time.
Yeah, time is key.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see any sort of particular startups that are sort of sectors within the startups that you think are going to sort of take off in the next sort of, between now and the next sort of 5 years or so, like a particular a trend of a sector that will take off?
Yeah, I'm going to give you not the expected answer. Everyone's going to say AI, and of course,
Yes.
and you've talked to multiple.
Good. I'm glad you're not, because I was going to follow it up with don't say
that.
AI.
Yeah, for sure. And there's heaps of people that I know you've spoken to several people who are in the AI space, and they've got some good insights. And of course, there's a heap of opportunity in that space.
Absolutely.
There's a space that I'm particularly interested in, which I think has got a lot of potential, and it's more in the health sector, but it's around clean air. So we're in the 6th year of the COVID pandemic. People are talking about other pandemics, that might be on the horizon, bird flu and other things that, we hopefully won't have to deal with. But what's become really clear over the last few years is that certainly with COVID, the reason people are getting infected again and again and developing things like long COVID is that it's an airborne virus. And historically, humans have completely neglected cleaning the air that we breathe, when we're around other humans. So, little thought experiment. If we were in a room and I gave you a bottle of water, I took a drink out of it, passed it, you guys had a drink out of it, you found 10 friends and you all got them to take a drink out of it, would we all think that was okay?
No.
No,
I
you go,
wouldn't have
hang
shared
on a
it
minute.
with anyone. End of story.
I don't even share mine with my kid.
No.
Yeah, seriously, they're the worst
like,
culprits
ew.
are the children.
I mean, she's 19, but
Yeah. So over hundreds of years, people have come to understand that that's a way that sick, illness spreads,
Germs
people get
spread.
sick. You
Yep.
don't want to do that. We're only just at the cusp of a realization as society that actually a lot of viruses are airborne and they're spread by inhaling the air that other people have breathed out.
Yep.
And so I think there's a massive opportunity, and we're starting to see a lot of companies emerging in this space around dealing with particularly indoor air, right? So they talk about,
Yeah.
COVID being a pandemic of buildings. So we're in an environment where we're all breathing each other's exhaled air. And if that person has, any of a range of viruses, they're spreading it, right? So
Yep.
if we deal with the indoor air, with things like filtering, improving ventilation, monitoring, there's a lot of work going on around the world in far UV light, which can inactivate viruses. So I see that as a massive opportunity.
I'm sitting here looking at our aircon now, going, like, don't bring my air oven.
I think ACs are even known for spreading
They
Legionnaire's
are.
virus.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
Legionnaire's
and
disease.
aeroplanes, I think, are a bad one too, aren't they?
Yeah.
Everyone gets sick when they get off of a flight.
Right?
I don't ever
Yep.
get sick until I go on a flight.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. And
Killer.
so, I mean, there's, without getting too much into the kind of doom and gloom, there's a lot of research now showing that things like long COVID are actually pretty serious illnesses. So there's some research from a team at Imperial College in London that showed that there's now an estimated 400 million people worldwide suffering from long COVID. And that can be
Really?
really debilitating. So there's a public health aspect to this, which is, we've got to improve that and stop people getting sick. But there's also an element of opportunity here. If we said, it's kind of like, I think of it like the early days of the internet, where, a bunch of companies like Intel and Qualcomm said, the internet's going to be a really big deal. If we make the infrastructure that makes the internet work, modems and routers and LAN cards and stuff like that, that's a big opportunity. I kind of think of that like where we are now with clean air and stopping people getting viruses. it's like, there's a whole bunch of infrastructure that we need in buildings that most buildings just don't have. So someone's going to make that, and it's a big opportunity.
How much money do you have?
I've got 2 cents.
Gotta go find it elsewhere. Look,
Have 2 cents for you.
we're definitely at the end of time. It's been an absolutely pleasurable conversation with you. I really appreciate your time. I want to leave you with 2 questions if you could help us out with. One is, do you have any advice for any of the female audience members that may be listening?
Yeah.
Because I personally, and I think we can all agree, the world would benefit if we had more female entrepreneurs and inventors. Based on your, experience working directly in that area, what do you feel could help them most break into this space?
I'll give you two things. One is, obviously, if you're in Queensland, you can do any of our female founders programs, and they're fully funded by the Queensland government. So that's something that's valuable. If you're not in Queensland or wherever you are, one really practical thing that I think all female founders or aspiring founders can do is to just start building their network with other entrepreneurs. It doesn't have to be all female, but I think there's a real pool of experienced female founders all around Australia who've got incredible experience in building their own businesses, and they really, really want to give back. It's not that if you really hassle them, they might give you some of their time. They're really motivated to give up their time to help other founders, who want to go on a similar journey. So I think I always encourage people to have a little spreadsheet with 2 columns. The first column is people that they know by name and can say, I want to connect with that person because I know they've built a company that's got some similarity with what I'm doing and I could learn from them. And the second column is people that you don't know who they are by name, but you can describe them by attributes. For example, an investor who's invested in, 3 or more female-led businesses. That would be a great person to connect with and, get their advice and help. And so then just, use your networks to connect with those folks and build that kind of inner circle of people that you can just lean on for help.
And the last question I've got here is, looking back on your journey, if you could press the restart button today with all the knowledge that you have, is there any piece of technology that you leveraged along the way that you'd recommend to other business owners or people that are looking to start up their own organization that you feel that they won't be able to live without, or could dramatically improve the quality of their life?
Yeah. I mean, there's no one thing, but there's something I think most people do way too late, and that's start building a mailing list. So, I see a lot of founders where they're trying to acquire customers by doing paid ad campaigns, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever it might be. And that can work. But at some point, you don't want to keep paying Facebook to talk to your customers, right? You want to own that relationship with your customers. So I think, whether you use MailChimp or Klaviyo or Squarespace or whatever as your kind of email marketing tool, I think investing some time and getting that going early is really valuable. And then finding clever ways to get people to engage with you. Obviously, producing content, whether it's a, fortnightly newsletter or whatever. I think for me, that's one of the things that I've seen lots of startup founders do way too late. And they kind of, they get 2 years into the business and they go, I don't really have a mailing list. I don't own a relationship with my customer. And I can't reach them.
Yeah.
That's an absolute pity.
Yeah. Isn't it? Imagine being years down the track and going, oh.
I don't want to imagine that at all. It sounds
horrible.
I
don't want to imagine that either.
But we've got 30 seconds left. Take an opportunity to help the audience find out where they can learn more about you, your product. Just take a moment to plug the business.
Yeah, sure. So Startup Onramp is operating nationally. We're at startuponramp.com. We have programs for female founders, which, as I said, are funded by the Queensland government for anyone who's based in Queensland. And we also work with founders nationally through our Founders course, which is our online self-paced course that teaches people how to start and maximize their chances of success. I also do a little bit of one-on-one coaching with startup founders. So there are people that, if there's a good fit, I'll work with them as an individual coach / mentor. And that's part of the fun for me. I get to spend time working with really smart people cooking up interesting businesses.
Amazing.
What I'd do to be a fly on the wall. Thank you so much for your time, Colin. I really appreciate it, and have an absolutely wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank
Colin.
you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye now. Megan, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for tuning in to the Tech Panel. If you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe on YouTube and follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn to stay connected. A big thank you to our major sponsor, SmoothLink Integrations, for powering today's episode. And join us again on the next episode of the Tech Panel, where tech minds meet.